they in somehow should not exist. There is a kind of possibility to relate to this trembling, that is not only a good thing. So I think it's much more than only a wish, which also makes it in somehow strong.
Yeah, I think this is a reason. I mean, at BAC we have dedicated quite some time to thinking about this matter specifically within the context of propositions for non-fascist living. First question is, are we held together or are we actually kept apart, right? And so we cannot assume that there is something that holds us together. I think, in my opinion, it's a hard labor to figure out ways of being together in these circumstances. But indeed, when you talk about the spectral and ghostly and written, it brings people together around various ideals of the future world. And this is really difficult to parse, actually, in a situation where you want to overcome the dichotomy of us versus them, because this is how we are already kept apart. So what are the ways of modeling that could help us circumnavigate around this? And for me, the notion of anticipatory learning, or maybe what you think about when you talk about how do we come together to learn what does not yet exist, is essentially a labor of imagining the world differently otherwise, but also enacting that other alternative imaginary, right? So I think these are quite important things to think about, and that connects me to the question you left us with, the last question, your last slide. And I would desperately want us to try to, in some way, address it. You know, is there a way we can start answering this? And there was a question about archives and museums, when you refer to the unarchivable, maybe unmuseolable. What's the proper word word to use here? I wouldn't quite know. You talk about unarchivable as the undercommons of the archive. Is there something as the undercommons of the museum we could activate to what you probably pointed at when you ask, can we, kiss it awake in some way? So I wonder whether you would like to take a step and answer your own question while I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually I would not call it unmuseable, because the museum is also the place of awakening of this conflict. It's not only the place of petrification. And in this sense, and why do I say that? Because actually the history of the museum, the modern museum, let's say, comes out of a revolution. So the fact that the things in the museum, that we talk about them as things that have been decontextualized and recontextualized, has, in my reading, to do with the fact that they have been taken away from the nobles and the church and have been reappropriated by the people. And this is what made them things in the museum, the Louvre. And this is actually a recommunalization. Now, we know that this recommunalization at the same time is the history of terrible violence and stealing and so on. So we have a double logic in this. So already two conflicts, and they kind of really move in the things there. And this is in somehow so the process of the museum is this, and now how to relate to that. I mean, it's calling us to relate in somehow.
Mm-hmm. Irit tells us unexposable. Ariola suggested unrepresentative. Thank you so very much. This is where my Englishese failed entirely. Important question, I think. Thank you, Rachel. What is the difference between trembling and ideology?
It's a tricky question, but maybe just to inflect it back through the discussion that you've just been having about museology. It really reminded me of the place that we got to at the end of the last collective conversation before this one with Stefano, which was, of course, the thing we're all in pursuit of, this kind of intensification of a kind of limit realization. When Stefano says, so how do we, the question is how to keep what's not given, right? Is my question also in relationship to Shea curatorially, right? How I perhaps wouldn't use the word keeping, because I'm thinking particularly in the discursive terrain of the visual arts and of museums, that keeping has an ideological definition, and it's quite hard to wrestle keeping out from the logics of property, as we see with repatriation of objects, for instance, right? So what we need is a different understanding of keeping. I think for me, my word is carriage, right? That one is not keeping anything, but rather one is carrying something for others. And so my question is, how is it that the museum becomes a kind of a space of carriage, not of objects actually, but of the things nonetheless carried within objects, right? That are perhaps unknown to the ideologies of the institution.
No, please finish. I want to try to answer this question, because I think actually, but I'm not sure, but it might be actually the completely different side of it. So in the sense of the classical example of Althusser, of ideology. So the policeman is calling me, and I look at the policeman, and in this moment when he calls me, I become this kind of police subject. But you know what happens in this moment? For example, I'm super afraid, so I start to create a weird sadistic game of desire. Because he calls me, I look back, I don't know why, but I hope that he looks at me, and then I hate myself because of that. And I actually don't want to be subjectified but I am. So I'm pretty angry, and I'm looking for someone else, and someone else and me, we have this kind of gaze, because we know that, okay, there might be a solidarity with and against and so on. And all this is the potential for the trembling. Is all this what happens at the same time when I am called. So now I'm completely cold and completely trapped, but all this desire and potential violence and potential solidarities are there at the same time. And there can be another call. There can be this moment when this kind of breaks out.
Jean-Mathé raised a hand. I wonder whether you would want to unmute yourself and pose the question yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much. I couldn't help, as I heard Nora and Adrian speak, I couldn't help but think of what's gone on in the last year at Columbia with Bernard E. Harcourt, and what happened at PS1, and then what happened at Santa Cruz with Gina Dent and Angela Davis, and the extraordinary time of barring time, or those who are doing time, and even those on death row, who they struggle to save as Trump tried to get his constituencies together, this extraordinary time of coalition between those fighting for the lives of those doing time, many of whom were incarcerated as teenagers and have spent their lives in solitary confinement. So there's something, one of the exhibitions linked with these sites that I've mentioned was called Barring Time. So just the doing of time and the extraordinary coalition between those that fight for abolition and show the relationship, the spectral infrastructures between the carceral logics